Imagine driving home through the quiet streets of your own neighborhood, the air filled with the soothing sound of jazz, your mind finally at ease after a long day. Now, picture the serenity shattered by flashing red and blue lights behind you, a police car pulling you over, its presence turning the peace of your sanctuary into a scene of tension and doubt. For Marcus Gray, a respected judge and role model in his community, this was no ordinary traffic stop. It was a confrontation that would expose the cracks in a system meant to protect, forcing him to face a bitter truth. No matter how high you rise, the color of your skin can still cast a shadow over your accomplishments. What began as a routine drive home quickly spiraled into an encounter that left a community divided and a family questioning how far justice could truly stretch. Before we dive into this gripping story of courage, confrontation, and change, comment below where you're watching from today. If you're already intrigued by this powerful tale, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more stories like this one. The evening air was cool and serene as Marcus Gray, a man who had fought hard for every ounce of success, guided his brand new Lexus through the quiet streets of Greenvale. This neighborhood, with its tree-lined avenues and sprawling homes, symbolized a lifetime of resilience and determination. For Marcus, each drive home was a chance to unwind, a brief escape from the weight of his responsibilities as a judge. That evening, jazz played softly through the car's speakers, a soothing rhythm that seemed to sync with the hum of the engine. Marcus, dressed sharply in his tailored suit, glanced at the warm hues of the setting sun painting the sky. He adjusted the air vent, letting the crisp breeze cool the remnants of a long day spent in court. As much as he loved his job, there were days when it drained him mentally, emotionally, and physically. For Marcus, life hadn't always been like this. Growing up in a rough inner-city neighborhood, he had faced challenges that most couldn't fathom. His journey to the bench was riddled with roadblocks, grueling years in law school, relentless battles against systemic racism, and an uphill climb through a justice system that seemed stacked against people like him. But he had persevered, becoming a symbol of hope for young black men who looked up to him as proof that success was possible, even against the steepest odds. The Lexus, barely a week old, was more than a car to Marcus. It was a testament to how far he had come. Each smooth turn of the wheel reminded him of the sacrifices he had made to provide a better life for his family. It was his reward to himself, and he reveled in the sense of pride it brought. But pride turned to unease when flashing red and blue lights suddenly illuminated the rearview mirror. Marcus's heart sank as the police cruiser pulled up behind him, its siren silent but its message clear. Confusion crept into his mind. He was certain he hadn't been speeding. Everything about his drive had been deliberate, careful, and peaceful. Pulling over to the side of the road, Marcus felt a tension settle in his chest. He had heard too many stories like this, stories that didn't always end well. And though he lived in Greenvale, a neighborhood where he should feel safe, Marcus knew his reality. Being a black man in an affluent area often attracted the wrong kind of attention. When the officer approached his window, Marcus rolled it down, determined to stay calm. Officer Blake, a tall, imposing figure with a cold expression, leaned down to peer into the car. "License and registration," she demanded curtly. Marcus furrowed his brow, but complied, reaching into his glove compartment to retrieve the documents. He handed them over, hoping for some explanation as to why he had been stopped. Blake, however, barely glanced at them before her sharp eyes returned to him, scanning him like he was a suspect in a crime. "Step out of the vehicle," she barked, her hand resting on her holstered gun. "Excuse me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but incredulous. "Step out of the car, now." The weight of the command hit Marcus like a blow. He swallowed hard, and the air suddenly felt heavy in his lungs. He reminded himself of who he was, a respected judge, a man of authority. Surely this was just a misunderstanding. "Officer, there must be some mistake," he began, his tone measured but firm. "I'm Judge Marcus Gray. This is my car. I live just down the street." Blake's expression didn't soften. Instead, her eyes narrowed further, suspicion etched into every line of her face. "Hands where I can see them," she snapped, stepping back slightly but keeping her hand on her gun. Marcus clenched his jaw, frustration rising in his chest. He had worked his entire life to prove his worth, to show that he was more than the stereotypes placed upon him. And yet, here he was, being reduced to just another black man behind the wheel of a luxury car. Swallowing his pride, Marcus stepped out of the vehicle, moving deliberately to avoid escalating the situation. The quiet streets of Greenvale were now bathed in the harsh, pulsing glow of the cruiser's lights. Behind curtains, neighbors peeked out, their silhouettes barely visible, but Marcus could feel their eyes on him. "Hands on the hood," Blake ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. Marcus hesitated, his gaze steady as he met hers. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Do it," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut through the cool evening air. Humiliation burned in Marcus's chest as he complied, placing his hands on the smooth metal of the Lexus's hood. The cold surface bit into his palms, but it was nothing compared to the sting of being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. As Officer Blake began patting him down, her hands mechanical and detached, she muttered something that made Marcus's blood run cold. "This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week," she said almost dismissively. Marcus's jaw tightened. "This is my car," he said through gritted teeth. "I bought it from the dealership days ago. Run the plates and you'll see." But Blake wasn't listening. Her actions spoke louder than her words. To her, Marcus wasn't a judge, a neighbor, or a man. He was a suspect. When she reached for her handcuffs, Marcus knew he couldn't let this go any further. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. "Before you make a decision you'll regret," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I suggest you call your superior officer." Blake paused, her hand hovering above the cuffs. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Marcus held her gaze, unflinching. "Do your job properly, officer," he said. "Run my plates and call your captain." Bookmark. The tension between them hung thick in the air, each second dragging like an eternity. Finally, with a muttered curse under her breath, Blake reached for her radio. As Marcus stood with his hands pressed against the hood of his car, he could feel the eyes of the neighborhood burning into his back. The once tranquil streets of Greenvale were now suffused with tension, the rhythmic flash of red and blue lights creating a disorienting backdrop. This was no longer just a routine stop. It had become a spectacle. And Marcus, unwillingly, was at the center of it. Officer Blake fumbled with her radio, her earlier confidence wavering as she spoke in clipped tones to whoever was on the other end. Marcus couldn't make out the garbled response, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. As the seconds dragged on, Marcus's thoughts raced. For years he had dedicated himself to upholding the law, to being a symbol of fairness and justice in a world that often lacked both. But at this moment, none of that seemed to matter. His title, his accomplishments, his reputation, all of it was eclipsed by the color of his skin. It wasn't the first time Marcus had felt the sting of racial profiling. Growing up, there had been countless incidents, each one chipping away at his sense of security. But as he climbed the ranks of the judicial system, he had allowed himself to believe that he had moved past those moments, that he had proven himself enough to be seen as more than just a black man. Now, standing in the harsh spotlight of injustice, he realized how naive that belief had been. Blake stepped back slightly, her expression flickering with something that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Was it embarrassment? Fear? He didn't care. Whatever it was, it wouldn't erase what had already happened. Marcus's mind shifted to his family, his wife, Sophia, and their two children, Ethan and Amelia. He thought of the talks he had had with Ethan, who was only 12 years old, about how to handle situations like this. "Stay calm," he had told his son. "Keep your hands visible, speak respectfully, de-escalate." He had hoped Ethan would never need to use that advice, that his son might grow up in a world where those rules weren't necessary. But tonight had shattered that hope. Marcus could already picture the questions Ethan would ask when he got home. "Does this ever stop, Dad? Do they ever stop seeing us like this?" The thought tightened the knot in Marcus's chest. He had always tried to answer with optimism, to show Ethan that hard work and integrity could overcome prejudice. But tonight, as he stood there in his own neighborhood, treated like a thief, he wasn't sure he believed that anymore. The radio crackled again, breaking the heavy silence. Blake's shoulders stiffened as she listened intently. The voice on the other end grew louder, more urgent, and Marcus caught the tail end of the exchange. "Captain Harris is en route." A small wave of relief washed over him. The wheels of justice, slow as they were, had started to turn, but it was a bitter relief. He shouldn't have had to demand a superior officer to assert his innocence. Moments later, the sound of another engine approached. A second police cruiser pulled up, and from it emerged Captain Harris, a seasoned officer whose graying hair and weary eyes spoke of years spent navigating the politics of law enforcement. Harris moved with purpose, his expression unreadable as he approached the scene. "Judge Gray," Harris called out as he neared. His tone was calm but carried an undercurrent of urgency. "I'm so sorry about this." Blake visibly tensed as Harris reached Marcus, glancing between the two men with a mix of defensiveness and unease. Marcus turned slowly, lowering his hands from the car's hood. His gaze was steady, his anger tightly controlled. "Sorry?" he repeated, the disbelief in his voice cutting through the night air. "That's the word we're using?" Harris exhaled heavily, his hand running through his hair. "It appears there's been a misunderstanding," he began, but Marcus cut him off. "A misunderstanding," Marcus said, his tone sharp. "That's what you call being humiliated in front of my neighbors? Being treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood?" Blake opened her mouth as if to speak, but Marcus's glare stopped her. He took a deliberate step closer to Harris, his voice low but firm. "I want to know," he said, his words carefully measured, "how a judge, a man who upholds the law, gets mistaken for a thief in the very community he serves. Explain that to me, Captain." Harris's face flushed, and for a moment he struggled to respond. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of Marcus's words hanging over the scene like a storm cloud. "We'll handle this, Judge Gray," Harris finally said, his voice quieter now. "I assure you, Officer Blake's actions will be reviewed and appropriate steps will be taken." Marcus's eyes narrowed. He had heard those promises before, empty reassurances that amounted to nothing more than a slap on the wrist behind closed doors. "That's not good enough," Marcus said. His voice didn't rise, but the force behind it was unmistakable. "This needs to be public. The community deserves to know what happened here tonight. They need to see that there are consequences for this kind of behavior." Harris hesitated, glancing at Blake, who stood frozen, her face pale. "Judge, I understand your frustration, but you don't understand," Marcus interrupted, his voice hardening. "You don't live this. You don't wake up every day knowing that no matter what you achieve, there will always be people who see you as less." Harris's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the ground. "You're right," Harris admitted. "You're absolutely right." Marcus took a deep breath, the tension in his chest loosening just a fraction. "Then do something about it," he said simply. The captain nodded again, his expression solemn. "We will, Judge. I promise you, we will." But promises alone weren't enough. Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over, not for him, not for his family, and not for the countless others who had faced similar injustices. As the night deepened, Marcus returned to his car, his mind racing with the steps he would take next. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about something much bigger. A battle for dignity, equality, and accountability in a system that so often failed the people it was meant to protect. The drive home was heavy with silence. The jazz that had brought Marcus such peace earlier now felt out of place, a distant memory drowned out by the events of the evening. The streets of Greenvale, usually a comforting sight, seemed unfamiliar, their stillness now tinged with a sense of betrayal. When Marcus pulled into his driveway, the sight of his home, his sanctuary, brought no relief. The two-story house with its well-manicured lawn and glowing porch light was supposed to represent safety and success. Tonight, it felt like a fragile illusion. He sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he tried to calm the simmering anger within him. This wasn't the first time he had faced discrimination, but something about this incident had cut deeper. Perhaps it was the humiliation of being targeted in his own neighborhood, or the harsh reminder that no matter how high he climbed, he could still be pulled down by the weight of systemic racism. The porch light flickered, and through the large windows, Marcus saw his wife Sophia moving around the kitchen. She was likely setting the table for dinner, unaware of what had unfolded just a few streets away. Sophia had always been his anchor, a source of unwavering support through every challenge he faced. Gathering himself, Marcus finally stepped out of the car and walked to the front door. The cool evening air did little to soothe his frayed nerves. As he reached for the doorknob, the door swung open, and there stood Sophia, her face lighting up in a warm smile. "Hey, love," she greeted, her voice as welcoming as ever. "Dinner's almost ready. How was your day?" Marcus hesitated, his forced smile barely concealing the storm brewing inside him. "It was long," he replied simply, stepping inside and setting his briefcase down near the hallway. Sophia's perceptive eyes studied his face, her smile fading slightly. She knew him too well to miss the tension in his expression. "Marcus," she said softly, closing the door behind him. "What happened?" He sighed, running a hand through his short, neatly trimmed hair. "I got pulled over." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Pulled over? For what?" Marcus's jaw tightened as the bitter words left his mouth. "Racial profiling." Sophia's face shifted from confusion to anger in an instant. "In this neighborhood?" she asked incredulously. "What officer was it? What did they say?" "Officer Blake," Marcus replied, walking past her into the kitchen. "She didn't say much, just assumed I'd stolen my own car. It wasn't until her captain showed up that she realized who I was." Sophia followed him, her arms crossed and her eyes blazing with indignation. "You're a judge. You're one of the most respected people in this community. How dare they treat you like that?" "It doesn't matter," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "None of that matters when they see my skin first." Sophia fell silent, the truth of his words sinking in. She understood this reality all too well. Though their lives were comfortable now, their success hard-earned, they could never fully escape the shadow of prejudice. Sophia herself had faced discrimination in her corporate job, where her intelligence and professionalism were often questioned or dismissed simply because of her race. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked after a moment, her voice quieter now but still filled with resolve. Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter, his hands gripping the edge as he stared at the floor. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Captain Harris said they'd handle it internally, but that's not enough. I can't just let this go. Not this time." Sophia stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You're right," she said softly. "It's not enough, but whatever you decide to do, you know I'm with you." Her unwavering support was a balm to his frayed nerves. Marcus nodded, grateful for her presence. "Thank you," he murmured. That night, after dinner and after their children were tucked into bed, Marcus sat alone in his study. The room, lined with shelves of legal books and adorned with framed certificates, felt both familiar and distant. Normally, this space brought him a sense of purpose. Tonight, it felt hollow. Opening his laptop, Marcus began drafting a formal complaint against Officer Blake. His fingers moved quickly over the keys, each word carrying the weight of his anger and determination. But as he typed, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Would this be enough? Would filing a complaint through official channels actually bring about change, or would it simply become another case buried in bureaucracy? Marcus paused, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He had spent his career working within the system, believing in its ability to deliver justice. But tonight, his faith in that system felt shaken. His gaze drifted to a photo on his desk, a picture of him with Sophia and their children, Ethan and Amelia, smiling together during a family vacation. The image filled him with both warmth and resolve. This wasn't just about him. It was about them. It was about every black family who had ever been targeted, disrespected, or dehumanized. Closing the complaint, Marcus opened a new document. This time, he began drafting a letter to the local press. His words were deliberate and bold, recounting the events of the night and calling for a public discussion about racial profiling in the community. This needs to be addressed openly, he thought to himself. People need to see what's happening and understand that it's unacceptable. As the words flowed onto the page, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been wrongfully judged because of the color of their skin. When he finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. The anger that had burned inside him all evening had transformed into something sharper, something stronger. Resolve. The house was quiet, and the only sound was the faint hum of his laptop. Marcus glanced out the window at the darkened street beyond, the same street where his humiliation had played out just hours earlier. He knew his neighbors had watched from behind their curtains, their faces hidden but their judgments palpable. Soon they would know the full story, and Marcus would make sure they couldn't look away. As he headed to bed, Marcus felt the weight of the night's events still pressing on his shoulders. But now it was balanced by a clear sense of direction. Tomorrow, he would take action. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that judged them before it saw them. The next morning, Marcus awoke with a sense of purpose, though the weight of what lay ahead was still heavy on his mind. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting long shadows across the floor. Today wouldn't be just another day. It was the start of something larger, a fight he knew would ripple far beyond his own experience. Sophia was already up, her light footsteps echoing from the kitchen as she prepared breakfast for the kids. The scent of coffee wafted through the house, but Marcus wasn't hungry. His thoughts were racing as he dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, his reflection in the mirror serving as a reminder of the resolve he needed to carry into the day. When Marcus walked downstairs, Sophia glanced up from the stove. Her eyes immediately honed in on the determined set of his jaw. "You're leaving early," she noted, her tone soft but curious. Marcus nodded, grabbing his briefcase from its spot near the door. "There's something I need to take care of," he replied, his voice steady. Sophia crossed the kitchen, her hand brushing against his arm as she stopped in front of him. "You're going through with it, aren't you? The press? The public statement?" He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I have to," he said firmly. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about all of us. If I don't speak up, who will?" Sophia sighed, her hand lingering on his arm. "I know," she said quietly. "Just be careful. You know how these things can escalate." "I will," Marcus assured her, his tone gentle. "But silence isn't an option anymore." Sophia nodded, though the worry in her eyes remained. They both understood the risks. Speaking out would stir up resentment and backlash in a town like Greenvale, where discussions about race and justice were often avoided. But they also knew that staying quiet would mean allowing the status quo to persist. With a final embrace, Marcus stepped out into the cool morning air. The chill sharpened his focus as he walked to his car. His first stop was the courthouse, where he planned to begin gathering evidence and drafting the materials he'd need for his next steps. By the time Marcus sent his letter to the local press, the first waves of reaction were already beginning to surface. Social media lit up with discussions as word of the incident spread. Some posts expressed outrage and solidarity, calling Marcus brave for speaking out. Others were defensive, dismissive, or outright hostile. Within a day, local news outlets picked up the story. Headlines ranged from objective, local judge alleges racial profiling in Greenvale, to sensational, judge claims police targeted him due to race. The response from the community was as divided as Marcus had expected. Support poured in from activists, friends, and even strangers who resonated with his experience. But alongside the support came resistance. Some residents, particularly those in Greenvale's wealthier and more conservative circles, were quick to push back. They dismissed Marcus's account as exaggerated, accusing him of playing the race card or stirring up unnecessary tension. One particularly vocal detractor, a businessman named Howard Temple, even penned an op-ed in the local paper titled, "Protecting Our Police: The Danger of Overreacting to a Routine Stop." The backlash didn't just affect Marcus. It seeped into his family's lives as well. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, the tension was palpable. Marcus's 12-year-old son Ethan was unusually quiet, pushing food around on his plate without eating much. "Ethan," Marcus finally said, breaking the silence. "What's wrong?" Ethan hesitated, his fork clinking softly against his plate. "Some kids at school. They were talking about you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's chest tightened. He had prepared himself for public scrutiny, but hearing how it affected his son was a blow he hadn't anticipated. "What did they say?" Marcus asked gently. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "They said you're making everything about race." That you're trying to get the officer in trouble for no reason." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Sophia's eyes flicked to Marcus, her worry clear. 8-year-old Amelia, blissfully unaware of the weight of the conversation, continued drawing on her placemat. Marcus exhaled slowly, setting down his fork. "Ethan," he began, his voice calm but firm, "what happened to me wasn't just about race. It was about something bigger. Do you understand that?" Ethan nodded, though the confusion in his eyes was clear. "I think so," he said quietly. "But it's hard when they keep saying those things." Sophia reached over, placing a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Your dad is standing up for something important," she said gently. "Something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. That doesn't mean he's wrong." Marcus looked at his son, searching for the right words. "Sometimes, doing the right thing means people will say things about you that aren't true," he said. "But that doesn't change what's right. You know what happened to me wasn't fair, right?" Ethan nodded more firmly this time. "I know," he said, though his voice was still tinged with uncertainty. "I just don't like people saying bad stuff about you." Marcus's heart ached at the earnestness in his son's voice. "I don't like it either," he admitted. "But that's part of the fight. If I don't stand up, if I don't speak out, this will keep happening to me and others. And that's something I can't allow." Ethan looked down at his plate, absorbing his father's words. Sophia gave Marcus a small, encouraging nod, her strength once again steadying him. When Marcus returned to the courthouse the next day, the atmosphere had changed. Colleagues who usually greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact. Conversations grew quieter as he passed, the tension in the air palpable. One of the senior judges, Harold Dixon, caught up with Marcus in the hallway as he headed to his chambers. "Marcus," Dixon said, his tone low and cautious. "Can I have a word?" Marcus nodded, though he could already guess where the conversation was headed. They stepped into an empty conference room, and Dixon closed the door behind them. "I've been hearing a lot about what's going on," Dixon began, his voice carefully diplomatic. "This thing with the police, it's really stirring things up." Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable. "I'm not saying what happened to you wasn't wrong," Dixon continued. "But going to the press like that? You're a judge, Marcus. We're supposed to maintain a certain level of decorum. You know how sensitive this town can be." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "And what would you have me do, Harold? Stay silent? Let them sweep it under the rug?" "I get that you're upset," Dixon said, rubbing his temple. "But you have to think about the long-term consequences. This kind of publicity, it could affect your career, your reputation." "This isn't about my career," Marcus said, his voice firm. "This is about justice. And if I can't stand up for that, then what's the point of any of this?" Dixon looked at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally he nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Just be careful," he said. "You've worked too hard to throw it all away over one incident." "One incident," Marcus repeated, disbelief lacing his tone. "This isn't just one incident, Harold. It's part of a much bigger problem, and if we don't stand up to it, nothing will ever change." Dixon didn't respond, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably. Marcus turned and left the room, frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior. The days following Marcus's public statement were anything but calm. Greenvale, once a seemingly serene and insulated town, had become the center of a growing storm. News of the incident spread quickly, far beyond the community. Social media platforms buzzed with debates, hashtags emerged, and local news channels aired detailed segments dissecting the story. Some voices rose in solidarity, praising Marcus for his courage in calling out injustice. Others were defensive, dismissing his claims or accusing him of exaggerating the situation to garner attention. The town's divisions, once carefully veiled, were now on full display. Marcus had anticipated pushback, but the intensity of the backlash still caught him off guard. Anonymous comments on social media accused him of playing the victim. Others suggested he was seeking special treatment because of his position as a judge. Some even went so far as to claim that Officer Blake was just doing her job, painting Marcus as a troublemaker who had escalated the situation unnecessarily. The phone calls and emails were relentless. Messages of support poured in from people who understood the importance of his stand, but they were drowned out by a flood of hostility. Some of the emails were outright threats, warning Marcus to back off or face consequences. Sophia tried to shield the kids from the uproar, but it was impossible to block out everything. Ethan, already grappling with comments from his classmates, overheard fragments of angry phone calls or snippets of news reports. Amelia, though younger and blissfully unaware of the full scope of the controversy, occasionally asked innocent questions that struck deep. "Daddy," she asked one evening as the family sat in the living room, "why do people think you're bad?" The question silenced the room. Ethan looked away uncomfortably, and Sophia's hand froze on her coffee mug. Marcus forced a smile, though his chest tightened painfully. "They don't think I'm bad, sweetheart," he said gently, pulling her close. "Some people just don't understand what I'm trying to do. But it's okay. I'll make them understand." Amelia nodded, seemingly satisfied, and returned to coloring in her sketchbook. But the moment lingered in the air, a stark reminder of how deeply the situation was affecting his family. A few days later, Marcus returned to the police station to meet with Captain Harris. The atmosphere was tense, and the weight of public scrutiny clearly took a toll on the department. Harris greeted Marcus in his office, his usual calm demeanor now tinged with wariness. "Judge Gray," Harris began, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat. "Thanks for coming in." Marcus sat down, his posture straight and composed. "Captain Harris," he replied, "I assume this is about the press conference?" Harris nodded, leaning forward in his chair. "Look, I won't lie to you. The situation has put the department in a difficult position. There's a lot of pressure from the community, from the mayor's office, and from within the force itself. Everyone's watching us now." "They should be," Marcus said bluntly. "This isn't just about one officer or one mistake. It's about a system that enables this kind of behavior." Harris exhaled heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "I get that. Believe me, I do. That's why I've arranged for a press conference tomorrow. Officer Blake and a representative from the mayor's office will be there. We'll make a public statement acknowledging what happened and outlining the steps we're taking to address it." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what exactly are those steps?" "Mandatory sensitivity training for all officers," Harris said. "A full review of Officer Blake's conduct and increased oversight for traffic stops in Greenvale." It was a start, but Marcus wasn't convinced it was enough. "And what about accountability?" he asked. "What happens to Officer Blake? What message does this send if she's allowed to walk away with a slap on the wrist?" Harris hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Judge, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Officer Blake is a good cop. She made a mistake, but she's not the villain here." Marcus's gaze hardened. "She may not be a villain, but her actions are a symptom of a broken system, Captain. A system that treats people like me as suspects first and citizens second. That's what this is about." Harris nodded slowly, his expression conflicted. "I hear you," he said quietly, "and I promise we're taking this seriously, but change doesn't happen overnight." "No," Marcus agreed, his voice resolute. "But it has to start somewhere, and it starts with transparency and accountability." Harris leaned back in his chair, his exhaustion evident. "You've made your point, Judge. I'll make sure it's heard at the press conference tomorrow." The following day, the press conference drew a crowd. Reporters, community members, and activists packed into the small conference room at City Hall. Cameras flashed as Marcus took his place near the podium, standing beside Captain Harris, Officer Blake, and a representative from the mayor's office. Captain Harris opened the conference with a prepared statement, acknowledging the incident and expressing the department's commitment to improving community relations. Officer Blake stood stiffly beside him, her face pale and her expression unreadable. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding the room. "This is not about one officer," he began, his voice clear and steady. "This is about a system that has failed too many times, a system that assumes guilt based on race, a system that profiles and discriminates without accountability." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. "Last week, I was treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood simply because of the color of my skin. That is unacceptable. And I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for every black man and woman who has been judged unfairly, who has been harassed or humiliated or worse without cause. This has to stop." As he continued, Marcus laid out the changes he wanted to see. Mandatory racial bias training, greater accountability for officers, and a community task force to rebuild trust. His words carried the weight of both personal experience and professional conviction, and by the time he finished, the room erupted in questions from reporters. He answered each one calmly, never losing his composure. When the conference ended, Marcus stepped away from the podium, knowing he had made his position clear. The press conference sent shockwaves through Greenvale and beyond. News outlets across the state picked up the story, sparking discussions about racial profiling and systemic injustice. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Justice for Marcus and End Profiling Now. For Marcus, it was a bittersweet victory. The conversation had started, but he knew it wouldn't end with a press conference. Real change would require sustained effort, persistence, and a willingness to confront the deep-seated biases that permeated the system. As he left City Hall that afternoon, Marcus felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready for the fight. In the days following the press conference, the town of Greenvale was a powder keg of conflicting emotions. The story of Marcus Gray's encounter with Officer Blake had gained traction far beyond the community. National news outlets picked it up, framing it as a pivotal moment in the ongoing conversation about racial profiling and systemic injustice. For Marcus, the attention was both a blessing and a burden. His actions had sparked vital discussions, but they had also deepened divisions within the town. Greenvale was now split into factions, those who supported Marcus's stand for justice and those who viewed his actions as an attack on the police force and the community's sense of order. At home, the strain was beginning to show. Sophia was as steadfast as ever, but Marcus could see the worry etched into her features. Ethan, already navigating the challenges of middle school, was struggling to handle the whispers and taunts from classmates. Even Amelia, though still young, seemed to sense that something was amiss. One evening, as Marcus sat at the dinner table with his family, the tension was palpable. Ethan barely touched his food, his usual chatter replaced by a sullen silence. "Go back, Ethan," Marcus said gently, setting down his fork. "Talk to me. What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Some of the kids at school," he said finally, his voice quiet. "They keep saying things about you." Sophia's gaze darted to Marcus, her concern mirrored in his own expression. "What are they saying?" she asked softly. "They're saying you're causing trouble," Ethan continued. "That you're making everything about race. One kid said you're just trying to get that officer fired." Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of his son's words pressing against his chest. He had known that taking a public stand would come with challenges, but he hadn't anticipated how deeply it would affect his children. "Ethan," Marcus began, his voice steady but firm, "what happened to me wasn't just about me. It's about something much bigger. Do you understand that?" Ethan nodded reluctantly but didn't look up. "I get it," he said, "but it's hard. They act like you're doing something wrong." Sophia reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Ethan's. "Your dad is doing the right thing," she said gently, "and sometimes when you do the right thing, people don't understand, but that doesn't mean you stop." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his son. "Ethan, this is what standing up for justice looks like. It's not easy, and it's not always popular. But if I don't do it, if we don't speak out, then nothing will change. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded again, more firmly this time. "I think so," he said, "but I still don't like it." "I don't like it either," Marcus admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But sometimes doing the right thing means making people uncomfortable." Ethan looked up at his father, his expression softening. "Okay," he said quietly. Sophia smiled at Marcus, her silent encouragement giving him strength. The challenges were far from over, but moments like this reminded him why he was fighting. As the debate over the incident raged on, Marcus knew he couldn't carry the fight alone. To create meaningful change, he needed to rally support from Greenvale's community leaders, those with the influence and resources to push for reform. The meeting was held at a local community center, a modest building that had long served as a hub for discussions and activism. Around the table sat a mix of individuals: pastors, business owners, educators, and activists. Among them was Reverend Charles Morrow, a respected figure who had spent decades advocating for racial equality in Greenvale. "Marcus," Reverend Morrow said as the meeting began, "you've stirred up something important, but you've also stirred up a lot of resistance. We need to be strategic about how we move forward." Marcus nodded. "I understand, Reverend. That's why I called this meeting. We can't afford to let this moment pass without action. We need to push for real, systemic change." The group discussed a range of issues, from racial bias in policing to the lack of diversity in Greenvale's local government. Marcus presented his proposals: mandatory racial bias training for officers, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, and the creation of a community task force to rebuild trust between residents and law enforcement. "These changes won't be easy," Marcus said, "but they're necessary. If we don't address the root causes of these issues, we're just putting a Band-Aid on a broken system." The room buzzed with conversation as the leaders weighed in. Some were cautious, concerned about the backlash that such changes might provoke. Others were passionate, eager to seize the moment and demand accountability. Reverend Morrow raised his hand, quieting the room. "Marcus is right," he said. "Change is never easy, but it's always worth fighting for. We need to stand united in this. If we fracture now, we lose the momentum we've built." The group agreed to form a coalition, pooling their resources and networks to push for the reforms Marcus had outlined. They planned community forums, public discussions, and outreach efforts to educate residents about the issues at hand. As the meeting ended, Reverend Morrow pulled Marcus aside. "You've got a lot of weight on your shoulders, son," he said, his voice kind but firm. "Don't try to carry it all alone." Marcus nodded, grateful for the Reverend's guidance. "Thank you, Reverend. I won't." While the coalition's efforts gained traction, the resistance from Greenvale's conservative factions intensified. Anonymous letters began arriving at Marcus's office, some filled with hateful rhetoric, others with thinly veiled threats. Phone calls at odd hours delivered similar messages, their voices warning him to back off. Sophia grew increasingly worried. "Marcus," she said one evening, "this is getting dangerous. You've got the kids to think about. You've got me to think about." "I know," Marcus said, taking her hand, "and I promise I'm being careful. But if we let fear silence us, nothing will ever change." Despite the threats, Marcus pressed on. He met with Captain Harris again, this time demanding more concrete action. He wrote op-eds for local and regional newspapers, sharing his story and calling for accountability. He spoke at town halls, addressing both supporters and skeptics with calm determination. "You're becoming quite the public figure," Sophia teased one evening, though her smile was tinged with worry. "Not what I set out to do," Marcus replied. "But I guess it's where I need to be." After weeks of relentless advocacy, Marcus began to see the first signs of progress. The mayor's office announced plans to implement some of the reforms Marcus and the coalition had proposed, starting with mandatory racial bias training for the police department. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. The conversation had shifted, and the town of Greenvale was finally beginning to confront the uncomfortable truths that had long been ignored. When Marcus returned home that evening, Sophia greeted him at the door, her arms wrapping around him in a tight embrace. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice filled with anticipation. "It went well," Marcus said, a small smile breaking through his usual stoicism. "We still have a long way to go, but we're moving in the right direction." Sophia leaned back, looking up at him with a mixture of pride and relief. "I knew you'd make a difference." "We're making a difference," Marcus corrected gently. As they stood together in the quiet comfort of their home, Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, he felt that real change was within reach. Marcus knew that the fight for justice wouldn't end with one press conference or a handful of policy changes. The work had only just begun. In the weeks that followed, he threw himself into the effort, determined to turn the momentum into lasting change. The coalition formed during the meeting with Reverend Morrow quickly became the heart of the movement. Community leaders, activists, and concerned residents worked together to hold forums, town halls, and workshops aimed at educating Greenvale's citizens about racial profiling and systemic inequities. The meetings weren't always easy. At one forum, a local resident, Frank Alden, a longtime Greenvale business owner, voiced his frustrations. "I respect what you're trying to do, Judge Gray," Frank said, standing at the back of a packed community center. "But not every officer is a bad apple. What about the good ones? Don't they deserve our support?" Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Frank, I agree with you. Most officers serve their communities with integrity. However, when the system allows even one officer to act with prejudice or abuse their power without accountability, it undermines everyone's trust. This isn't about vilifying the police, it's about making sure the system works for all of us." The room fell silent as Frank nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Fair enough," he said. Moments like that gave Marcus hope. The forums weren't just about airing grievances. They were about bridging divides and fostering understanding. Bookmark. Go back. As Greenvale grappled with the changes sparked by Marcus's story, the national spotlight continued to shine brightly. News outlets invited Marcus for interviews, and his calm, articulate responses earned him both respect and admiration. During an interview on a popular news program, the host asked, "Judge Gray, what would you say to people who believe you're overreacting? That this was just an isolated incident?" Marcus paused for a moment before answering. "I would say that those people are missing the bigger picture. This wasn't just about me being pulled over. It's about a system that treats people of color as guilty until proven innocent. I've spent my entire career fighting for justice, and I won't stop now, just because some people are uncomfortable with the truth." The clip went viral, sparking further discussions on social media. Messages poured in from across the country, some supportive, others hateful. Marcus read each one carefully, using the positive messages to fuel his determination and letting the negativity roll off his back. Sophia, however, struggled with the growing scrutiny. One evening, she approached Marcus as he sat at his desk reviewing notes for an upcoming town hall. "Marcus," she said softly, "we need to talk." He looked up, concern etched across his face. "What is it?" Sophia hesitated, then sighed. "The threats are getting worse. The phone calls, the emails, it's too much. I know you're doing the right thing, but I'm scared for you. For us." Marcus stood, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know it's hard," he said, "and I don't blame you for being scared. But if we back down now, we let them win. I won't let fear stop me from doing what's right." Sophia nodded, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Marcus said, pulling her into an embrace. Despite the challenges, Marcus's efforts began to bear fruit. The mayor's office announced plans to establish a civilian oversight board, a key demand from the coalition. The police department began rolling out mandatory racial bias training for all officers, and a pilot program for de-escalation techniques was launched. But progress didn't come without resistance. A group of Greenvale residents, led by businessman Howard Temple, organized a counter-movement, accusing Marcus of tearing the town apart. They held rallies of their own, framing their efforts as a defense of law enforcement. At one of these rallies, a speaker declared, "Greenvale doesn't have a racism problem. What we have is a division problem, and it's being caused by people who want to make everything about race." Marcus heard about the rally from a colleague and felt a familiar pang of frustration, but instead of letting it discourage him, he used it as motivation. That evening, he drafted an op-ed for the local paper addressing the counter-movement directly. "Unity doesn't come from ignoring injustice," he wrote. "It comes from confronting it head-on. Pretending that racism doesn't exist doesn't make it go away. It allows it to thrive in silence. If we want to heal as a community, we must first acknowledge the wounds." The article sparked heated debates but also earned widespread praise for its thoughtful and measured tone. Amid the chaos, Marcus remained deeply aware of how the situation was affecting his family. Ethan, in particular, was still grappling with the weight of his father's public battle. One evening, Marcus found Ethan sitting on the porch, staring out at the quiet street. He sat down beside his son, the cool night air wrapping around them. "What's on your mind, kiddo?" Marcus asked gently. Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. It's just a lot." Marcus nodded, waiting for him to continue. Why do people hate you? Ethan asked finally, his voice small. Marcus's heart ached at the question. They don't hate me, Ethan. They hate what I represent. Change is hard for some people, and it makes them uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to make things better. Ethan looked up at him, his brow furrowed. Do you think it'll ever stop, the way people see us? Marcus sighed, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. I don't know, he admitted, but I do know this. Every step we take brings us closer to a better world. And if I can make things even a little bit better for you and Amelia, then it's worth it. Ethan nodded, a small flicker of understanding in his eyes. I think I get it, he said. Marcus smiled, ruffling his son's hair. That's all I can ask for. As weeks turned into months, the changes in Greenvale became more tangible. The Civilian Oversight Board was officially established, and the coalition continued to push for additional reforms. Community members who had once been skeptical began to see the value of the efforts, and attendance at forums and town halls grew steadily. One evening, Reverend Morrow called Marcus with exciting news. Marcus, he said, his voice brimming with pride, the state's Attorney General just announced plans to use Greenvale's reforms as a model for other towns. This is bigger than any of us imagined. Marcus smiled, the weight of the past months momentarily lifting. That's incredible news, Reverend, he said. It means all this work is paying off. It is, Morrow agreed, and it's because of you, Marcus. You started this. No, Marcus replied firmly. We started this, and we're not done yet. As Marcus hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time he could see a path forward, a path toward real, lasting change. Months had passed since the incident that had shattered Marcus Gray's quiet life in Greenvale, but the ripple effects were still being felt. The town, once known for its picturesque streets and surface-level harmony, had become a focal point in the larger conversation about racial profiling and systemic injustice. For Marcus, the fight had become more than personal. It was no longer just about what had happened to him. It was about creating a world where his children, Ethan and Amelia, wouldn't have to face the same prejudices he had endured. The reforms Marcus and the coalition fought for were beginning to take hold. The police department underwent a noticeable shift, with new policies emphasizing de-escalation and racial bias training. Officers were now required to attend quarterly workshops led by experts in cultural competency, and the Civilian Oversight Board was actively reviewing complaints to ensure accountability. While the changes were promising, Marcus knew they were just the first steps. True transformation required more than policies. It required a shift in mindset. To that end, he and the coalition launched a series of educational initiatives, partnering with schools and local organizations to foster dialogue about race, equity, and justice. One of the most impactful initiatives was a storytelling project. Residents from all backgrounds were invited to share their experiences with law enforcement and discrimination. The stories, compiled into a powerful exhibit at the community center, opened eyes and hearts in ways statistics never could. At the opening of the exhibit, Marcus stood alongside Reverend Morrow, watching as visitors moved through the space, pausing to read each story. This is what change looks like, Reverend Morrow said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Marcus nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. It's a start, he replied. Despite his successes, Marcus couldn't ignore the toll the fight had taken on his family. He worked tirelessly to shield Ethan and Amelia from the negativity swirling around their lives, but there were moments when the weight of it all broke through. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Ethan sat quietly on the couch, his expression troubled. Marcus noticed and sat down beside him. "Talk to me?" Marcus said gently. Ethan hesitated, then looked up at his father. "I heard some kids at school saying you're trying to ruin Greenvale," he said, his voice small. Marcus's heart sank, but he kept his expression calm. "And what do you think?" he asked. Ethan shrugged. "I know you're trying to make things better, but it's hard when people say stuff like that." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "It is hard," he admitted. "But remember this. Just because something is hard doesn't mean it's not worth doing. The people who don't understand now might come around one day. And even if they don't, we're doing this for the people who need it the most." Ethan nodded slowly, his father's words sinking in. Nearby, Amelia sat on the floor, drawing a picture of their family. She looked up and smiled. "Daddy's a hero," she said simply, her innocence cutting through the tension like sunlight. Marcus chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, his heart swelling with pride. Sophia, watching from the kitchen, met Marcus's gaze and smiled. It was a reminder that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, they would face it together. Not everyone in Greenvale embraced the changes. The counter-movement led by Howard Temple continued to hold rallies and circulate petitions, arguing that the reforms undermined the police and created unnecessary tension in the community. One particularly tense moment came during a town hall meeting, where Temple confronted Marcus directly. "Judge Gray," Temple said, his tone sharp, "don't you think these reforms are going too far? The police are under enough pressure as it is. How do you expect them to do their jobs when they're constantly being scrutinized?" Marcus met Temple's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Accountability doesn't hinder good officers, Mr. Temple. It empowers them. If we want to build trust between the police and the community, we have to ensure that the system is fair for everyone." The room erupted into applause, drowning out Temple's rebuttal. Moments like these reminded Marcus why the fight was worth it. Change was never easy, but it was always necessary. As the months turned into a year, the reforms in Greenvale began to inspire neighboring towns to take similar actions. Marcus was invited to speak at events across the state, sharing Greenvale's journey and encouraging others to push for justice in their own communities. One particularly moving moment came when Marcus received a letter from a young man named David Harper, who lived in a small town several miles away. "Judge Gray," the letter began, "I want to thank you for what you've done. I'm 18. And last year I was pulled over for no reason other than driving through a neighborhood where people didn't think I belonged. I've been afraid to speak up, but your story gave me the courage to do so. Because of you, I feel like things can change." Reading the letter, Marcus felt a surge of emotion. It was a reminder that every step forward, no matter how small, had the power to make a difference. One evening, after a long day of meetings and advocacy work, Marcus sat on the porch of his home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness he had always cherished about Greenvale. Sophia joined him, handing him a cup of tea before sitting beside him. "You've done a lot this year," she said, her voice soft. Marcus nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's been hard," he admitted, "but it's also been worth it." Sophia reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "You've made a difference, Marcus, not just here but everywhere. People are listening, they're learning, and that's because of you." Marcus looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's not just me," he said. "It's all of us. The coalition, the community, the people who've stood up and spoken out. Change doesn't happen because of one person, it happens because of a movement." Sophia squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with pride. "You've built something powerful, Marcus, and it's only the beginning." As they sat together in the fading light, Marcus felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. The fight wasn't over, but the foundations had been laid. Marcus knew that his efforts would leave a lasting impact, not just for Greenvale, but for the countless communities struggling with the same issues. This was his legacy. The story of Marcus Gray is more than just a tale of injustice. It's a testament to the power of resilience and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. It shows us that change is never easy, but it's always worth fighting for. Marcus's journey reminds us of the importance of speaking out against wrongs, not just for ourselves, but for the greater good. Through his actions, Marcus didn't just seek justice for himself. He inspired a movement that brought his community together and pushed for systemic change. His story is a powerful reminder that every voice matters and that the choices we make today can shape a better tomorrow for future generations. As we reflect on this tale, the lesson is clear. True progress requires courage, determination, and unity. Marcus faced resistance, endured personal sacrifices, and navigated intense scrutiny, but he never lost sight of his goal. He believed in the possibility of a more just and equitable society, and his story challenges us to believe in that possibility too. Let Marcus's journey be a call to action for all of us. Whether it's in our communities, workplaces, or personal lives, we have the power to stand against prejudice and fight for what's right. Change begins with each of us. If you found this story moving, let us know. Comment 1 if you thought it was good, and 2 if you found it truly inspiring. Share your own experiences and stories in the comments. We'd love to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to catch more powerful and thought-provoking stories like this one. Together, we can keep these important conversations alive and inspire change where it's needed most. What are your thoughts on Marcus's journey? Let us know below.